The room was still laughing when I realized nobody was going to stop it. Holden's finger was still extended, still pointed directly at me, his champagne glass catching the chandelier light above our table. Every face in that Buckhead venue had turned in my direction, some with open amusement, some with the tight, uncomfortable smiles of people who laughed before they thought about it, and now couldn't take it back, and some simply frozen in the awful stillness of people pretending not to hear what had just been said. He had said it casually. That was the part that settled into my chest like cold water. That's the only black burden we keep up with. Not shouted, not slurred. Said the way you say something you have said privately many times and have finally decided deserves an audience. The venue was a private rental. The Campbells had taken the entire space. No outside guests. No strangers. Every person in that room had been personally approved by Douglas Campbell, and enough people had laughed loudly enough for the damage to finish itself before silence finally began creeping back into the room. I sat at the family table, at a wedding I helped pay for, with 16 years of a life I had built beside James Pemberton. And my stepson was still smiling. I had known Holden since he was 8 years old. I packed his lunches. I sat in hospital waiting rooms at 2 in the morning. I covered for him twice when covering cost me something. I chose to believe in a version of him that, looking at his face right now, I understood had never fully existed. My name is Florine Pemberton. I have owned and operated my own real estate agency in Atlanta for 19 years. I know what it looks like when someone performs for an audience. I knew exactly what Holden was doing before the laughter finished moving around that room. 2 tables over, Douglas Campbell sat with members of his foundation board and watched without expression. He did not laugh. He did not intervene. He simply observed. The way men observe things they have already decided are not their responsibility to stop. If you have ever poured yourself into someone else's child and loved them like your own blood, drop your location in the comments. Just your city. Just so I know you're here. Because I need you to stay with me through everything I'm about to tell you. Then James stood up. His chair scraped back and the sound cut through that room faster than any word could have. The laughter collapsed unevenly, conversations stopping mid-sentence, glasses lowering, faces changing shape as people realized too late that they had participated in something uglier than they first allowed themselves to believe. James's voice was low. Only the nearest tables caught it clearly. "You've made a mistake. Expect what's coming." Holden's reply came back loud enough for the entire venue to hear. "Do your worst." He was still smiling when he said it. Still holding that glass. Still performing for a room that had already given him exactly what he came for. James looked at me. I stood. We walked out together. No scene, no tears, no pause in the doorway. Just 2 people leaving a room that had finally shown us exactly what comfort, status, and silence could turn ordinary people into when somebody else became the target. In the car, James drove and I said nothing. The Atlanta skyline moved past the window. 11 minutes of complete silence between us. Then I spoke. 1 sentence. James heard it. He nodded once and kept his eyes on the road. I raised that boy for 15 years. I knew exactly what I was going to do before we reached the end of that driveway. I was awake at 3 a.m., not crying, sitting at the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the house breathe around me, organizing what I knew into what I was going to do about it. James woke before sunrise. I heard him. Not the alarm. James hadn't used an alarm in years. Just the quiet shift of his weight leaving the mattress. He didn't come to the kitchen first. He didn't make coffee. He went directly to his office and pulled the door closed behind him. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the low register of his voice through that door. Not the words, just the shape of the conversation. Measured, unhurried, the tone of a man who has already decided something and is now putting it in motion. I had been married to James Pemberton long enough to know that when he moved quietly, he moved permanently. 20 minutes later, he came out, filled 2 cups without asking, and set mine on the counter in front of me. He sat down across the table. We looked at each other. Neither of us said a word about the night before, and neither of us needed to. I drove to my agency before 8. Pemberton and Associates sits on the 4th floor of a midtown building I have worked out of for 11 years. My name is on the door in brushed gold lettering that I paid for myself. I have never once walked into that office without knowing exactly what I came to do. I went to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled a physical folder. The kind I keep on paper because paper doesn't disappear in a server update and can't be altered without evidence. Inside was a dated memo I wrote 2 years ago, the account access incident. Holden had reached into a joint property account that my income had contributed to and withdrawn funds without authorization. James and I had handled it privately. Holden returned the money, offered a thin apology, and I had chosen to absorb it for the sake of the family I was trying to protect. But I had documented it the same week it happened. Renata had countersigned the memo as standard office protocol, her signature and the date at the bottom making it a corroborated record rather than a personal account. I read it once, set it on the desk, picked up my phone. That afternoon, James called Holden. I wasn't on the call, but James told me everything afterward, the way he always does. Without embellishment, without editorializing, exactly what was said. James asked Holden if he had anything he wanted to say. Holden said he had been honest and that everyone needed to stop being so sensitive. James said, "All right." He hung up. I have turned that word over many times since then. Not because it surprised me, because of how final it was. James didn't argue, didn't threaten again. Didn't give Holden a door to walk back through. Just, "All right." And the call was done. That single word was the last thing James said to his son for a very long time. That evening, after dinner, James told me he had called his attorney before sunrise. The will had been restructured. He said it the way he might mention he'd scheduled a car service, plainly, without ceremony. He did not explain further. I did not ask him to. The grief was still present, but it was changing shape, moving from something that hurt into something I was organizing. I picked up my phone and dialed Martin Sayers' office. His assistant answered on the second ring. I gave her my name, my profession, and told her I needed a consultation. The appointment was set for 48 hours later. The drive to Midtown takes 22 minutes from our house in Buckhead. I have made it for 19 years. Same roads, same turns, same parking structure on the 4th level. This morning, I made it counting things. Not buildings. Not traffic lights. What belongs to me? What has my name on it? What can be proven in a room where feelings mean nothing and documentation means everything? I went straight to the locked filing cabinet when I got in. Not the desk drawer. The cabinet where I keep the originals. Mortgage contribution records for the Buckhead property. The deeds for both investment properties, my name on each one. The percentage breakdowns from when those properties were purchased, showing exactly what portion of the financing came from my agency's income. I laid everything across my desk in sequence and looked at it the way I look at any property portfolio before a major transaction, not with emotion. With assessment. What I saw was this. Holden Pemberton had spent years assuming he understood the financial architecture of his father's life. He did not. He saw the house. He saw the properties. He calculated what he believed was coming to him without once considering that my name was attached to every significant asset in that picture. He had made plans around an inheritance that was never entirely his father's to give. Renata came in at 8:30. She set coffee on my desk, pulled the chair across from me, and sat down without asking what was wrong. That is the thing about working alongside someone for 11 years. They learn when to wait. I told her enough. Not everything. Enough for her to understand the shape of what I was doing and why the memo mattered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's still in the system. Hard copy in the records room and digital in the shared drive. Both dated, both countersigned." I nodded. That was the whole conversation. We didn't need more than that. I was reviewing the deed percentages when my phone rang. Holden. The first time he had called me directly since the dinner. I let it ring once more than necessary before I answered. His tone was almost warm. The specific warmth of a man who believes reaching out is itself a generous act. He said we should move past it. That it was a joke and weddings make people say things. That I knew how these evenings go. That James would come around. He always did. He talked for nearly 3 minutes without pausing long enough for me to speak, which told me he had rehearsed this and was afraid of silence. When he finished, I said, "I appreciate you calling, Holden." Nothing else. I ended the call. Opened my notepad and wrote the time, the date, and everything he had said, as close to word for word as memory allows. The characterization of the comment as a joke, the suggestion that James would come around, the framing of my response as sensitivity rather than his conduct as harm. He called it a joke. A joke requires the other person to eventually laugh. I never laughed. I set the notepad beside the 2 folders already on my desk. Everything was in sequence now. The memo, the deed records, the contribution breakdowns, the call summary. 2 folders that together told a story anyone could follow. Martin Sayers' office was expecting me tomorrow morning at 9. I closed the cabinet, turned off my desk lamp, and went home to James. Martin Sayers' office on the 14th floor of a Peachtree Street building has the kind of quiet that costs money to maintain. I had referred 2 clients to him over the years and shared a table with him once at a chamber dinner. He was the kind of attorney people described as methodical, not flashy, not loud, just someone who built cases the way a good contractor builds foundations. Solid from the ground up. I had never once imagined sitting across from him as a client. I laid everything out in the order it happened. The racial remark from 3 years ago, said about me at a social event by Holden, carried back to me by a colleague the following week. I had sent myself an email that same evening documenting exactly what was said, who relayed it, and the date. That email existed in my server with a timestamp that predated anything Holden could now claim was fabricated in response to the dinner. I showed Martin the printout, then the account access incident, the memo, Renata's countersignature, the date, Holden returning the funds, and the thin apology James had witnessed directly. Then the wedding dinner. Then Holden's phone call, 2 days after, my written summary, timed and dated, capturing his characterization of the comment as a joke, and his assertion that James would come around. I presented it the way I present any property portfolio, sequenced, sourced, and without visible emotion. Martin listened to every word without writing anything down, which told me he was the kind of man who trusted his retention and saved his notepad for what came after. When I finished, he asked 2 questions. Is the prior remark documented in any form that predates this filing? I confirmed the time-stamped email. Is your name currently on all 3 properties? I confirmed it was. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone uncertain, but the quiet of someone organizing. Then he told me what he believed he could realistically build. A civil claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress anchored to the documented pattern across 3 years rather than the single dinner incident. The wedding dinner as the culminating public act in an established sequence of conduct. He was careful about how he framed it. He told me directly that the IIED bar in Georgia was high, and courts did not hand those claims out casually. Sustained conduct mattered. Corroboration mattered. Demonstrable professional or personal impact mattered. He said my documentation gave him something stronger than most people arrived with, but he would still approach the claim conservatively and pair it closely with the property and asset issues where the paper trail was strongest. Then he told me about the discovery request. 18 months of communications between Holden Pemberton and members of the Campbell family. He said it, plainly, without emphasis. He watched my face when he said the word Campbell. My expression did not change. He noted that. I could see him note it. He told me the real legal weight lived in the asset protection claim, formally establishing what belonged to me in permanent public record, and in that discovery process. A family like the Campbells, he said, would feel discovery before they felt anything else. Their private communications, internal correspondence, and discussions touching Holden during the 18 months before that dinner could become subject to review if the court allowed broader production. Could become. That distinction mattered, and Martin made sure I understood it. He told me what portions of the case looked strongest on paper. What he didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was what the filing itself might cost them professionally long before any final courtroom outcome arrived. I authorized him to proceed. He said he would file within the week. Driving back to Midtown, I saw a missed call from James. I called him back and he answered on the first ring. I told him what Martin was preparing and why. James said, "Good." One word. Absolute. The call ended. Holden Pemberton went to work at Campbell Properties on a Tuesday morning believing the worst was behind him. I know this because of how he moved through those days, the texts he sent James that went unanswered, the version of events he constructed and then repeated until it felt like the truth. He had told Darcy the dinner was an overreaction, that I had always been sensitive, that James would come around because James always did. There had been tension before, small friction, and it had always resolved itself. He believed this one would too because he needed it to, and because nothing in his life had yet taught him the cost of being wrong about something this size. Darcy had listened to his version without much pushback. Holden read her silence as agreement. I would later understand it was something else entirely. But that understanding belonged to a different chapter of this story. What Holden didn't know on that Tuesday morning was that Martin Sayers had already begun drafting, that the time-stamped email from 3 years ago, the memo with Renata's countersignature, the deed records showing my name on every property, and the written summary of Holden's own phone call were already organized inside a legal file with his name on the cover. He didn't know that the architecture of his assumed inheritance was being examined by someone whose job was to identify exactly where it was vulnerable. He went to his desk at Campbell Properties and worked a full day believing the silence from James was temporary. 3 days after the dinner, Derek Osei posted something on his professional social media. Renata sent me the screenshot without commentary, just the image, dropped into our message thread at 7:42 in the morning. I read it twice. Derek hadn't named anyone. He was too careful for that. What he wrote was restrained in the way professionally advised people become restrained when they understand liability. He referenced witnessing conduct at a private event that conflicted with his professional values and stated that, after consideration, he would not be pursuing future business relationships connected to the parties involved. No names, no racial language, no identifiable details beyond what people already present in those circles might privately infer for themselves. Before forwarding it to me, Renata had already checked something else. Derek had comments turned off. That detail mattered. This wasn't a man trying to create spectacle. It was a man creating distance in public view without inviting discussion around it. Within the next 2 weeks, it began moving quietly through certain circles. Atlanta's black professional networks are smaller than they appear from the outside, and slower at first than most people realize. People who recognized enough of the description to privately connect it to the Campbell name began asking careful questions, in direct messages, after board lunches, at the edges of conversations officially unrelated to any of this, until gradually they weren't. I forwarded the screenshot to Martin the same morning Renata sent it. He noted it and told me not to engage in any form. I didn't share it, didn't comment, didn't acknowledge it publicly. What I did was document it, the date it, posted, the platform, the approximate professional reach I could observe, and the fact that Derek had deliberately limited public interaction beneath the post. I told Martin, "If this comes up later, I want the record to show I knew about it and did nothing to amplify it." He said that was exactly the right instinct. I didn't need to say a word. Derek said what he was prepared to stand behind professionally. The rest moved the way truth usually moves in cities like Atlanta, slowly, privately, and through people with enough context to recognize what they were looking at without needing it explained publicly. The walls were closing around Holden Pemberton, and he could not feel them yet. That gap, between what he knew and what was already moving quietly around him, was where everything lived. Martin filed the civil claim on a Thursday morning. Holden was served at Campbell Properties shortly after 2 p.m. the same day. A process server arrived during business hours and delivered the filing directly to him near his desk, while several employees were still working nearby. Nothing theatrical, nothing raised above a normal speaking voice. But by the end of the afternoon, people in that office understood something serious had entered Holden Pemberton's life. My phone buzzed at 2:19 p.m. A text from Martin. 2 words. "It's done." I set the phone face down on my desk, looked at the property file open in front of me, and sat with that for exactly 1 minute. Then I picked the phone back up and sent him a single word of acknowledgement. Then I went back to work. What happened at Campbell Properties at 2:17 p.m. that Thursday, I did not witness directly. What I know, I pieced together later, from what James told me and from details that surfaced during the proceedings. A colleague had carried the envelope to Holden's desk without knowing what it contained. Standard delivery, nothing in the packaging to signal what was inside. Holden had opened it the way you open anything at your desk on a Thursday afternoon. Casually, without preparation. His face went still when he read his name on the filing. Not angry, not immediately. Just still. The particular stillness of a person whose mind is moving very fast, while their body has temporarily stopped receiving instructions. He read it through once. Then he understood what it was. Not a letter. Not a complaint that could be managed with a phone call. A civil filing. Permanent. Public. Attached to his name in Fulton County Superior Court in a way that no conversation could undo. He called James within the hour. James told me about the call that evening, not editorializing, just the facts of it, the way he always reports things to me. Holden's voice had lost its casual register entirely. What had replaced it was something James said he had never heard from his son before. A rattled quality, something close to genuine disbelief. As if some part of Holden had never fully believed I would do it. Holden told James that I had filed a lawsuit. James said, "I know." Holden asked if James was going to do something about it. James said, "She has every right." The call ended. Holden called Darcy next. I have no direct access to that conversation, and I have never sought it. What I can account for is what happened after it. Darcy drove to her parents' house that evening. She and Evelyn sat together for close to 2 hours. I would not know what passed between them in that room until much later. Darcy would tell me herself, in her own time, in a conversation I had not expected to have. What I could read from the outside that evening was simply the direction things were moving. By the following morning, Evelyn Campbell's name had appeared in Martin's call log. Martin called me mid-morning to confirm that the discovery request had been formally received by Campbell Properties' legal team. Their response window had begun. Douglas Campbell's personal attorney had already called Martin's office, not to discuss terms, not to negotiate, just to confirm receipt and to make clear that serious legal representation was now in place on their side. That call told me everything I needed to know about how frightened they were. Families with nothing to lose don't retain outside counsel to confirm receipt of a discovery request. They respond through their standard team. Douglas Campbell had made a separate call. That was its own kind of answer. The filing was out. The discovery request was live. The Campbell name was attached to a public legal document referencing racial conduct at their family's event. Everything from this point forward was consequence. I went home. James was in the kitchen. We had dinner, quietly, normally, as if it were any other Thursday evening in our house. We didn't discuss it. We didn't need to. James reached across the table and covered my hand with his. That was the whole conversation. I was not in that room. I want to be clear about that. What I know about the Campbell family meeting I pieced together afterward, from Martin's notes, from what Darcy eventually told me herself, and from the shape of every decision the Campbells made in the weeks that followed. When a family that powerful moves in a particular direction, the movement tells you what happened in the room that produced it. Douglas called the meeting at the Campbell home the evening after the discovery request landed with their legal team. Present were Douglas, Evelyn, Darcy, Holden, and the family's outside legal counsel. The same attorney whose separate call to Martin's office the previous morning had already told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking this. Holden arrived believing this was the moment. He had been waiting for it the way a man waits for reinforcements he has never once doubted are coming. He had made a mistake. He understood that now in the limited way that people understand mistakes when the consequences have begun arriving. But he had the Campbells. He had married into this family. He had a position at their firm and a seat at their table and a father-in-law whose name was on a building 3 blocks from the courthouse, where his name now appeared on a civil filing. He walked into that meeting believing the weight of all of that was about to shift in his direction. The family attorney opened without preamble. He laid out the civil filing, the nature of the claim, and the discovery request, specifically what producing 18 months of communications between Holden and members of the Campbell family would require. He was precise about what those communications were likely to contain. Holden had told the Campbells things about his inheritance expectations during the period he was pursuing Darcy. He had represented his financial future in terms that James had never authorized. Those representations existed in writing. The attorney did not need to name Douglas in his exposure analysis. Douglas was already doing that mathematics himself, quietly, with his hands folded on the table in front of him. Holden began to speak, to explain, to find the framing that positioned him correctly inside what was happening. Douglas raised one hand, not with anger, not with volume, simply the way a man raises his hand who has never once in his adult life needed to raise his voice to be heard. The room went quiet immediately. Holden stopped. Douglas looked at his attorney and asked one question. What was the most efficient path to protecting the Campbell name? The attorney answered. His answer addressed the discovery request, the exposure around the inheritance misrepresentation thread, and the public profile of the filing given Derek's post and the conversations already circulating in Atlanta. His answer was thorough, specific, and professionally complete. It did not include defending Holden Pemberton's conduct at the wedding dinner. It did not mention Holden's interests at all. Holden sat in that room, the room he had believed was built for him among the people he had chosen over his own family, and watched them discuss how to contain the situation he had created. Nobody asked what Holden needed. Nobody asked how to protect him. The attorney spoke. Douglas listened. Evelyn watched Darcy's face the entire time and said nothing to reassure her. The Campbells didn't abandon Holden at the courthouse. They abandoned him in their own living room weeks before we ever got there. He just didn't know it yet. The following morning, Evelyn Campbell picked up her phone and called Martin Sayers' office. Martin called at exactly 9 a.m. Evelyn Campbell's office reached out this morning. She wants to talk. I was already at my desk. I set down my coffee and thought about that for exactly the amount of time it deserved, which was not long. Then I told Martin precisely how to receive it. Cordial, professional, zero concession, no signal of softening in any direction. Schedule the call, represent me entirely, and report back everything. He called me again 2 hours later. Evelyn had not been on the call herself. She had sent counsel, which told me the first thing I needed to know. A woman reaching out in genuine concern picks up her own phone. A woman managing exposure sends a representative with prepared language. Martin walked me through it without editorializing. The Campbell family, her counsel said, was distressed by what had occurred at the wedding. The incident did not reflect their values as a family. They held great respect for the Pemberton family and hoped a resolution could be reached that served everyone's best interests going forward. Her counsel delivered all of it smoothly, without pause, in the particular register of someone reciting a position rehearsed enough times to sound natural. Martin had listened to every word, taken notes, made zero commitment in any direction. Then he told me something else. 2 days earlier, one of Douglas Campbell's foundation board members had requested a private conversation regarding recent concerns connected to the family name. Martin said the timing mattered. Counsel rarely reaches out before influential people begin asking questions internally. That explained the speed of Evelyn's call more than anything else. When Martin finished reporting, I asked him one question. Did she apologize? There was a brief pause on his end. The pause of a man choosing his words carefully. She expressed distress. That's what I thought, I said. I instructed Martin to respond with complete cordiality and zero movement, a gracious acknowledgement of the outreach. Nothing that could be read as softening. Nothing opening a door toward settlement discussion. We were not negotiating. We were not adjusting. We were going to court, and the Campbells' discomfort about that was not my responsibility to manage. I sat with what Evelyn's outreach actually meant for a moment after we hung up. She had not reached out because she felt remorse. She had reached out because the Campbell name was already moving through conversations she could not fully enter or control. Derek's post had done what carefully worded, professionally restrained posts do in tight Atlanta circles. It had given people just enough context to privately recognize what they were looking at, and just enough uncertainty to begin asking careful questions. I had not shared it. I had not commented on it. I had not directed a single person toward it. The truth had simply begun moving on its own once I stopped being the person covering it. Families with the Campbells' level of civic exposure do not send outside counsel to express distress unless something measurable has already shifted beneath them. Quiet calls from philanthropic partners, board members requesting clarification before meetings, institutional people beginning to calculate distance privately before they calculate loyalty publicly. The kind of friction that never appears in newspapers, but absolutely changes the temperature inside important rooms. Evelyn's outreach had not weakened my position. It had confirmed it. For the first time since the wedding dinner, the Campbells were no longer managing Holden alone. They were managing risk around themselves. 3 days after that call, my phone showed a new message. It was from Darcy, not sent through attorneys, not relayed through James. A direct private message from Darcy Campbell Pemberton to my personal number, in her own words, without the architecture of legal representation around it. She asked if we could meet. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and looked out at the Midtown skyline for a long moment. Then I replied, yes. I agreed to meet Darcy because I wanted to look at the woman Holden had chosen over his own family and understand exactly what that choice had cost everyone in the room. Not out of cruelty. Out of the specific need a woman has sometimes to see the full picture of a thing before she closes it. She had chosen Virginia Highland. I approved of that. Neutral ground, far enough from Buckhead and Campbell circles that nobody who mattered to either of us would be watching. She arrived before me and was already seated when I walked in. She looked like someone who had not slept properly in 2 weeks. Her hands were around a water glass she wasn't drinking from, and she watched the door with the particular attention of someone who wasn't sure the person they were waiting for would actually come. I arrived exactly on time, ordered coffee, sat down across from her, and waited. She spoke first. She said she didn't know it would go this far, that Holden had told her it would blow over, that his father always came around, that I had always been sensitive about certain things, that the dinner was being made into something larger than it was. She said her parents had only ever wanted what was best for their family. She spoke for several minutes, circling something she could not bring herself to land on directly. At no point did she say the dinner was wrong. She came close. I could see her approach it and pull back twice. But she could not get herself all the way there. I let her finish completely. Then I spoke. I told her I raised Holden from the time he was 8 years old, that I covered for him twice when covering cost me something real. Not because I was weak, but because I believed in the family we were building, and I chose that belief over my own discomfort. I told her what I absorbed and why I absorbed it. I did not discuss the case. I did not mention Martin or the discovery request or anything with legal weight. I simply told her the truth about who I was and what I had given. And then I stopped talking and let her sit with the distance between that truth and what happened at that dinner. Something shifted in her face while I spoke. Not resolution. She wasn't capable of that yet. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The beginning of it. Then she told me about the family meeting. Not everything, but the shape of it. The attorney laying out the discovery exposure. The moment Douglas raised his hand and Holden stopped mid-sentence. The way Evelyn had watched Darcy's face throughout the entire meeting without once offering her anything reassuring. She said she had driven home afterward and sat in their apartment and understood for the first time that she had married into something she hadn't fully seen clearly. I listened to all of it and stored it carefully. Darcy cried before we left the table. I didn't. Not because I felt nothing, but because I had already cried everything that belonged to that season of my life. What was left in me by then wasn't grief. It was direction. I watched her walk out of that restaurant carrying something she would not be able to put down. At home, James listened to everything I told him without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me something he hadn't said before, that 4 months before the wedding, Holden had come to him privately and asked about accelerating part of his inheritance. James had said no. Holden had then told the Campbells something different about what was coming to him. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I called Martin. Add the inheritance misrepresentation to the discovery framing, I said. I want it in the record. I dressed that morning the way I dress for every meeting that matters, deliberately, without rush, with the specific intention of being taken seriously by everyone in the room before I open my mouth. Not performance. Preparation. There is a difference, and I have always known it. Fulton County Superior Court is procedural and fluorescent, and completely indifferent to the personal histories of the people who pass through it. That indifference was exactly what I needed. I did not want a room that felt anything. I wanted a room that recorded. Martin was beside me when we took our seats. He had his files organized in the order we had discussed. He did not need to review them, neither did I. We had built this case document by document across weeks, and everything in those folders was already inside both of us. This hearing was procedural as much as substantive. Arguments around the discovery record, the pattern evidence, and whether portions of the claims would survive intact moving forward. Nothing about this stage was final yet. But important things happen in preliminary hearings long before final rulings arrive, especially when a judge begins showing how she is interpreting the shape of a case. Holden entered with his attorney, a litigator the Campbells' legal team had recommended, but were not paying for. Martin's team had confirmed that detail during preparation and noted it without comment. It told us something specific about the nature of the Campbells' support, present enough to direct, distant enough to disclaim. Holden scanned the room immediately when he walked in. I watched him do it without turning my head. The particular sweep of a man looking for the people he believes are there for him. He found the Campbells in the third row behind him. Douglas and Evelyn, listed as potential witnesses, present on the advice of their own counsel who sat between them in the proceedings, like a deliberate physical boundary. Holden looked at Douglas. Douglas met his eyes for a moment, then looked away. That was all. No nod. No signal. Nothing that could be read as solidarity or instruction or even acknowledgement beyond the brief, neutral fact of eye contact. Holden turned back to face the front of the courtroom, and I watched something leave his posture in that turning. A quality he had carried since the night of the dinner, since the morning after, since the day he was served, believing it would come to nothing. It left him quietly, without drama, the way certainty leaves a person when the last thing holding it in place looks away. The proceedings moved through the documented pattern in sequence. Martin presented each incident as part of a deliberate trajectory. The time-stamped email from 3 years prior, the account access memo with Renata's countersignature, the wedding dinner as the culminating public act of an established pattern of conduct. Holden's attorney worked to argue each incident as isolated, contextually minor, insufficient on its own. That argument required the judge to see 3 separate events rather than one sustained pattern. Martin's entire strategy rested on her seeing the line connecting them. Renata's countersignature was the weight Holden's attorney had underestimated. He had seen the memo during discovery. He knew it was real. What he had not fully accounted for was what independent professional corroboration did to the credibility of the pattern argument. It removed the possibility of framing the documentation as self-serving. Someone else had signed it. Someone with no personal stake had put her name and the date on that record years before any of this reached a courtroom. James was called. He walked to the stand the way he does everything, without performance, without hesitation. He confirmed the account access. He confirmed his private conversation with Holden afterward. He confirmed Holden returned the funds and offered what James described, precisely, as a thin apology. He confirmed that Florine had handled the situation with more grace than it required. I did not look at Holden while James spoke. I had not come to that courtroom to watch him suffer. I had come to make the record reflect the truth. Those are different things. The judge did not rule from the bench. Before adjourning, she noted that the documented pattern presented raised serious concerns about sustained conduct toward a family member across multiple years and warranted further consideration in written findings. The courtroom was very quiet. Holden stared at the table in front of him. Written decision expected within several weeks. In Martin's car afterward, he told me the inheritance misrepresentation thread, formally entered into the discovery discussions, had already triggered internal concern inside Campbell Properties. The Campbells were managing more than one fire now. Martin called me the morning after the hearing. Not Evelyn's office this time. Not a representative with prepared language and careful framing. Douglas Campbell's personal attorney had called Martin directly. And that distinction told me everything before Martin relayed a single word of what was said. Evelyn's outreach had been concern dressed as negotiation. This was Douglas moving. Those are different things, and they required different responses. Martin came to my office that afternoon and laid the proposal on my desk. It was formal and structured in the way serious legal documents are. No softness in the language, no performative gesturing toward emotion. A financial acknowledgement of harm in a specific dollar amount. A formal retraction of the public comment entered into the legal record. A mutual agreement to conclude active proceedings, including negotiated limitations on further discovery production. Every element was specific. Their legal team had assessed the exposure carefully and priced it seriously. The dollar figure was real. It would matter to most people. I read every line without rushing. Martin sat across from me and waited. When I finished, I looked up and asked him 2 questions. Does accepting this keep the remaining discovery communications from becoming part of any broader filing or deposition review? Martin said it likely would. Does declining leave discovery active and subject to further court review if expanded production is allowed? Martin said yes. I folded the document along its center crease and slid it back across the desk toward him. He did not look surprised. I think he had read me well enough by then to expect it. What the Campbells did not know, what their attorney could not have fully known when he structured that proposal, was that I no longer needed a financial settlement to understand the weight of the shift already happening around them. What mattered now lived inside discovery. 18 months of communications between Holden and members of the Campbell family. The inheritance representations Holden made during the courtship. The financial assumptions he encouraged. References to future access James had already refused privately. Messages discussing Holden's projected position inside the Pemberton estate structure. Martin believed several exchanges could become relevant to motive and credibility if broader production continued. Not because they proved criminal conduct, but because they documented how heavily Holden's perceived value inside that family had been tied to expectations James himself had never approved. The Campbells had received those representations. In some instances, they had responded to them directly. There were discussions about future property positioning, timing, and stability that looked considerably less comfortable once the inheritance narrative itself became unstable under scrutiny. That was the pressure point. Not scandal. Exposure. Families like the Campbells survive embarrassment all the time. What they manage aggressively is documented uncertainty around judgment, vetting, and internal decision-making, especially once outside counsel starts warning about discoverable communications and institutional relationships begin asking careful questions. Their attorney understood this. That was why Douglas had made the call personally rather than routing everything through Evelyn's careful channels. The Campbells offered money because limiting discovery was safer than extending it. I declined because the discovery process itself had become more valuable than a quiet settlement. I wasn't interested in what they were willing to give me. I was interested in what continued scrutiny might place into formal record. Martin left my office with the declined proposal, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of what I had just decided. Not triumphant, certain. There is a difference. That same week, I learned this afterward, not from Martin, but from a contact in Atlanta's commercial real estate community. Holden's position at Campbell Properties began changing in ways subtle enough to avoid attention outside the firm, but obvious to anyone inside it. Meetings he normally attended moved forward without him. Two responsibilities were reassigned. A client dinner he had been expected to join suddenly no longer required his presence. Then his supervisor suggested they meet privately off-site. No announcement, no dramatic dismissal. Just professional distance being created gradually around a problem the firm no longer wanted attached too closely to its name. He had gone to that firm as a son-in-law with a future. He was now being repositioned as a liability the Campbells needed to contain carefully. The Campbells protected what they had always protected: their name, nothing else. Holden Pemberton did not lose his job all at once. That was the first thing he misunderstood. What happened instead was slower and considerably more expensive. The meetings began happening without him first. Then client dinners moved locations, and nobody updated his calendar. Development calls he normally led were reassigned quietly for efficiency. Weeks passed like that, not dramatic enough to confront directly, not normal enough to ignore. By the time Campbell Properties formally discussed restructuring his position on a Wednesday morning, the real decision had already been made long before he entered that office. His marriage began ending around the same time, though Holden would not understand the sequencing for a long while, that those two things moved together because the Campbells had already decided privately, and Darcy was simply the slower-moving consequence of a choice her parents had made weeks earlier in their living room. Darcy did not leave dramatically. She was not built for that. What she did was begin to be less present in the way carefully raised women sometimes disappear, incrementally, with reasonable explanations attached to each absence. Dinners at her parents' house that started at 7 and ran until well past 10. Weekends framed as family obligations she needed to prioritize for a while. Conversations with Holden that became shorter without becoming hostile. Careful in the way conversations become careful when someone is measuring every word against a decision they haven't yet said aloud. Holden watched it happen and could not stop it. He still believed there was a version of this that could stabilize if he explained himself correctly enough. He called James and asked if they could meet. James agreed. One dinner. Neutral location. Holden arrived first. James told me this detail without being asked, the way he tells me things he knows matter. Holden was already seated when James walked in, and he looked like a man who had been sleeping in fragments and thinking in circles. He looked, James said, like someone who had run out of people to call before he called his father. Holden talked for a long time. He explained the dinner as a performance that got away from him. He justified the years before it as the ordinary confusion of a young man trying to find his place. He said the Campbells had made him feel that demonstrating distance from his family was the price of belonging with theirs. That he had paid it gradually without fully understanding what it was costing him while he was doing it. At some point, he admitted something else. He said he kept believing status would protect him from consequence because, until now, it always had. Then he ran out of language and sat in the silence he had made. James listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "I'm not angry with you, Holden. I'm finished with a version of you that I kept hoping would change." Holden asked about the will. James told him it had been handled the morning after the dinner, and that it was not something they were going to revisit. Holden received that the way a person receives confirmation of something they already suspected, but had still been hoping was wrong. Not with shock, with a specific deflation. Then he asked about me. James said, "That's not my conversation to have for her." James told me everything that same evening. He said Holden cried near the end. I sat with that for a long time, Not because it moved me back toward him, but because I remembered the boy he was before he decided who he wanted to become. The boy who ate at our kitchen table and called me after his first job offer and stood at his bedroom door at 15, not knowing how to ask for help with something embarrassing. That boy and the man at that wedding dinner were the same person. I had simply loved one of them longer than the other deserved. The grief in this chapter was not mine. It belonged to the choices Holden had made freely, in full knowledge of what he was choosing, because he believed he would never have to fully account for them. On Saturday morning, his car appeared in front of our Buckhead house. My car was in the driveway. He sat outside without moving for 11 minutes. I saw his car from the upstairs window. He had parked across from the house, not in the driveway, not at the curb directly in front, but slightly offset, the way someone parks when they haven't fully committed to being there yet. I watched him sit without moving for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I counted without meaning to, standing at the window with my coffee going cold in my hand. Then I went downstairs and opened the door before he knocked. He was standing on the second porch step, not at the door, not retreating toward the car, suspended between the two. He looked at me, and I watched something move across his face that I had not seen there before. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to the specific disorientation of a person who has been fundamentally wrong about someone for long enough that seeing them clearly for the first time requires a physical adjustment. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside. We sat in the living room, the room where I chose every piece of furniture across 2 years of this marriage. The house whose mortgage my income helped carry for 16 years. 15 years of a life built in these walls surrounded us, and neither of us acknowledged it directly because neither of us needed to. It was simply present, the way true things are present, without requiring announcement. Holden had prepared something. I could tell from the first sentence the particular smoothness of language that has been arranged in advance. It lasted less than a minute before it began coming apart. Rehearsed words require the other person to respond at the right moments, to provide the cues that keep the structure standing. I did not provide them. I sat and I listened, and I let the silence do what silence does to prepared language when nobody fills it on schedule. What came out of him after that was not the apology he had rehearsed. It was something more complicated and considerably more honest. He said he had spent years wanting to belong somewhere that would elevate him above what he came from. He said that belonging had required him to construct a version of me that was smaller than I was, lesser, manageable, a burden rather than a foundation, because the alternative was acknowledging what he was trading away, and he had not been willing to do that. He said the dinner was not a moment of weakness. He said he knew that now. He asked what he could do. I was quiet for a long moment. Then I told him the truth. Not with anger. I had spent that long before we ever reached this room. Not with satisfaction. This was not a moment I had built toward for pleasure. I told him I had covered for him twice because I loved him and that the covering had never been weakness. It had been a choice made from something genuinely maternal, the kind of feeling that doesn't require biology to be real. I told him what happened at that dinner was not a mistake that found its voice in a single night. It was a decision constructed over years that simply ran out of places to hide. I told him I did not hate him. I told him I was done. When I finished, I sat quietly and let him receive it. Not because I wanted to see him suffer, because he had earned the truth and I had spent 15 years giving him things he hadn't earned. The truth was the last one. He left without a scene, without last words, without the resolution his rehearsed apology had been designed to produce. The door closed behind him. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet of it. Then I went back upstairs. The judge's written decision arrived the following Tuesday. Martin called at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was already at my desk when my phone lit up with his name. I picked up my files, walked into my private office, and closed the door behind me. Renata was already on a call across the floor. The agency was moving the way it always moves on a Tuesday morning. Steadily, without drama, indifferent to what I was about to hear. I sat down and said, "Tell me." Martin read the asset protection finding first. My marital property interest in all three properties, the Buckhead home and both investment properties, formally established and protected in permanent public record. My name on those deeds had always been real. Now it was also uncontestable. Whatever Holden had assumed was coming to him through his father had always run through me first, and the court had now said so in language that would outlast every conversation anyone had tried to have around it. Then, he read the IIED finding, partially upheld. The judge's language was careful and narrower than Martin had originally argued for. She referenced the sustained nature of the conduct across a documented 3-year period, the deliberate public context of the wedding dinner as the culminating act in an established pattern, and the professional and personal harm caused to Florine Pemberton specifically. Not every allegation had survived intact, but enough had. Enough for the court to formally recognize a documented trajectory rather than isolated incidents viewed separately from one another. Limited compensatory damages were awarded, not punitive, not excessive, proportionate to the documented harm and professional impact Martin had established through corroborated records and testimony. A portion of attorney's fees assessed separately. Martin finished reading. I thanked him. We spent 4 more minutes on logistics, next procedural steps, the formal conclusion of proceedings, what the public record would now contain, and when. Then I hung up. I sat in my office for a while after that, not celebrating, not crying, not reaching for my phone to call anyone, just sitting inside the specific stillness of a moment I had been moving toward since the night of that dinner. Since the car, since James's pre-sunrise phone call, since the locked filing cabinet and the time-stamped email and Martin's 2 questions and every calculated step that followed. The decision entered the public record. Derek O.C.'s post, the one that had moved quietly through Atlanta's professional networks months earlier, now had a court finding attached to it. People circulated excerpts from the decision document privately. Not me. I shared nothing. But Atlanta is the size it is, and the Campbell name carries the weight it carries, and people who recognized both were now reading a judge's written language about conduct that occurred at a Campbell-hosted event in Buckhead. The consequences moved the way consequences usually move in professional circles, quietly at first. Questions, internal conversations, calls that did not make newspapers but still changed the temperature in rooms. Douglas Campbell's foundation board requested a formal discussion tied partly to concerns that had surfaced during discovery. Evelyn stepped back from 2 civic committees over the following month. No public statement, no scandal. Just gradual distance placed between the Campbell name and unnecessary attention. I did not call anyone to tell them the decision came in. I did not post anything. I did not need the world to know I had won, because the world, the part of it that mattered, already knew what had happened at that dinner. The decision was not for the world. It was for the record. And the record now reflected exactly what was true. James arrived at the agency just before noon. He had brought food from the place on West Peachtree we had been eating from for 12 years. He set it on my desk, sat down across from me, and looked at me for a moment. Then he asked, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, the true one. "Like myself," I said. 6 months after that dinner, Atlanta in early autumn, when the heat finally concedes and the morning air carries something cooler and cleaner through the city streets. I make the drive to Midtown the same way I have made it for 19 years. Same roads, same turns, same fourth level of the parking structure. This morning, I am counting things. The 19 years my name has been on that agency door. The 16 years James and I have had dinner at the same table in the Buckhead house. The 2 investment properties generating income that my financial contribution helped build, and that the public record now confirms belong to me without qualification. The clients Renata is already handling when I walk in at 8. 3 calls before I reach my desk. The agency moving the way it always moves, steadily and without drama, because I built it to run on something more durable than my presence alone. This is my life, fully, specifically, without apology. Renata looks up when I come through the door and nods once, the shorthand of 11 years between 2 professionals who do not need to perform their regard for each other. I hang my coat, sit at my desk, and open the first file of the morning. Outside the window, Atlanta is doing what Atlanta does in October, moving fast and indifferent and full of people building things. That evening, James and I have dinner at home. He has cooked, nothing elaborate, just the specific meal he makes when he wants the evening to feel ordinary and chosen rather than routine. We eat and talk about things that have nothing to do with courtrooms or attorneys or the Campbell name. The Buckhead house is quiet around us in the way that houses become quiet when the people inside them have finally stopped waiting for something difficult to arrive. Holden exists at the edges of my life now, the way a closed chapter exists. Present in the sense that it happened, absent in the sense that it no longer requires anything from me. I do not know exactly where he is living. I do not know the precise status of his marriage. James knows very little. Holden has not called since that Saturday at the door. And the silence between them has settled into something neither hostile nor hopeful. Just distance. The natural distance between people whose choices have taken them somewhere they cannot come back from without doing something they have not yet done. I do not spend time in that distance. I have my own geography now. There is something I have not told you yet. Something I said in the car that night. 11 minutes of silence. James driving. The Atlanta skyline moving past the window. And then one sentence. Just one. I carried it through everything that followed without setting it down because it belonged at the end, not the beginning. James, I need you to take me home. Tomorrow I have work to do. That was all. That was everything. No declaration, no battle cry, no announcement of what was coming for anyone. Just a woman who already knew what she was going to do and had no need to say it loudly, because she had never needed volume to be effective. I went home. I slept. I got up in the morning and I went to work. My name is Florine Pemberton. I built my agency from nothing. I raised a boy who chose to forget what I was to him. And I married a man who never did. That dinner was the last night I covered for anyone. Everything after it was just me, finally, completely, and without apology, being exactly who I had always been.